Emily, a wildlife photographer, craved solitude. Her work often took her to remote locations. She thrived in the stillness of nature, finding beauty in its untamed heart. So, when a job opportunity arose in the secluded town of Willow Creek, she didn't hesitate. Willow Creek was nestled deep within a valley, shrouded by ancient forests and an eerie silence. The town itself was small, its inhabitants seeming to carry the weight of generations past. From the moment Emily arrived, a sense of unease settled upon her. The locals were wary of her, their gazes lingering a beat too long. Their eyes held a coldness that sent shivers down her spine. They spoke in hushed tones, their words barely audible against the ever-present whisper of the wind through the trees. It was as if they were bound by a shared secret, one they were unwilling to share with an outsider. One evening, as Emily unpacked her belongings, an old woman approached her. Her face was etched with wrinkles, her eyes like chips of ice. "This town ain't fit for the likes of you," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Best you leave while you still can." Before Emily could respond, the woman turned and disappeared into the growing shadows. Emily tried to shake off the unsettling encounter. She reminded herself that small towns were often wary of newcomers. Yet the old woman's warning lingered in her mind, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile soil of her unease. Days turned into nights, and the unsettling feeling persisted. Emily threw herself into her work, seeking solace in the familiar embrace of nature. She spent her days hiking deep into the surrounding forests, her camera her only companion. The forest was alive with the sounds of birdsong and the rustling of leaves, yet even here, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, Emily returned to her rented cabin on the outskirts of town. The cabin was small but cozy, with a large window that overlooked the woods. As she sipped her tea, she noticed something strange. There were footprints in the soft earth outside her window, footprints that hadn't been there before. The footprints were too large to belong to a child, and they weren't the typical prints of a hiker. They were too deep, too deliberate, as if something heavy had been standing there, watching her. A shiver ran down Emily's spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and the trees swayed violently, their branches scraping against her windowpane. She imagined the old woman's words, "This town ain't fit for the likes of you." What had she meant? What secrets did this town hold? Just as Emily was drifting off to sleep, she heard it. A soft scratching sound at her window. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly sat up in bed. She strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. Had she imagined it? Emily told herself it was just a branch scraping against the glass. The wind was strong tonight, after all. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She got out of bed and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting the woods in an inky blackness. Emily strained her eyes, trying to make out any shapes in the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw something move near the edge of the trees. A flicker of movement, gone as quickly as it had appeared. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky, casting the woods in a brief, stark light. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall and slender, shrouded in a dark cloak that concealed its features. It stood perfectly still, its presence as unnerving as its sudden appearance. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. Was it real or a figment of her overactive imagination? Before she could rationalize it, the figure turned its head and looked directly at her. The feeling of being watched, so pervasive in the past few days, intensified 100-fold. It was as if the figure's eyes could pierce through the darkness, seeing into her very soul. Emily stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She fumbled for the light switch, bathing the room in a warm glow. Section 4. Unsettling Offerings. When she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Emily stood there for a long moment, her heart still racing. She tried to convince herself that it had been a trick of the light, a shadow playing on her fear. But deep down, she knew what she had seen. Sleep was impossible that night. Emily lay in bed, her mind racing. Who or what was the figure in the woods, and what did it want? The old woman's warning echoed in her ears, fueling her growing sense of dread. The next morning, Emily awoke with a start. The sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the floor. She had slept later than she intended, her dreams filled with unsettling images of the hooded figure. She got out of bed and went to the kitchen to make coffee, hoping that caffeine and sunlight would chase away the lingering fear. As she reached for the sugar, she noticed something strange. There was a small wooden box sitting on her kitchen counter, It hadn't been there before. Emily cautiously approached the box, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a simple box, crafted from dark wood and adorned with strange, intricate carvings. Emily hesitated for a moment before reaching out and lifting the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a single white feather. The feather was long and slender, its tip stained a deep crimson. Emily recoiled, as if she had been burned. Where had this box come from, and what did the feather signify? The box and its unsettling contents were just the beginning. Over the next few days, Emily found more strange gifts left on her doorstep. A small clay figurine of a bird with outstretched wings, its eyes two black beads that seemed to follow her every move. A bundle of dried herbs that filled her cabin with a cloying, almost sickly sweet scent. Each gift was more unsettling than the last, chipping away at Emily's composure. She tried to rationalize them, to convince herself that they were just pranks by the local kids. But deep down, she knew better. These were not the actions of mischievous children. They were warnings, omens of something far more sinister. One evening, as Emily sat in her living room, reading a book in a vain attempt to distract herself, she felt a cold draft. She looked up and saw that the window was open, the curtains billowing gently in the breeze. She distinctly remembered closing it earlier. She got up to close the window, and that's when she saw it. The hooded figure was back, standing just outside her window. This time, however, it was closer than before. Close enough that Emily could see its face, or rather, what should have been its face. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, an empty blackness that seemed to suck the light from the room. Emily gasped in horror, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The figure stood there for a long moment, its empty gaze fixed on Emily. Then, slowly, deliberately, it reached out its hand and tapped on the glass. The sound of the figure's hand against the glass shattered the paralysis that had gripped Emily. She stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp in her haste to get away from the window. The lamp crashed to the floor with a loud thud, plunging the room into darkness. Emily scrambled to her feet and fumbled for the light switch. Her hand trembled as she flicked the switch, bathing the room in a harsh, unforgiving light. But when she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Emily stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still feel the figure's empty gaze burning into her, even though it was no longer there. She had to get out of this house, out of this town. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. There was no signal. Of course, there was no signal. She was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by ancient forests and shadowed valleys. Suddenly, Emily heard a noise outside, a soft rustling sound like the wind blowing through leaves. But there was no wind tonight. The air was still and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. Emily crept closer to the window and peered out into the darkness. The trees surrounding her cabin swayed gently, even though there was no wind. And then she saw them. Dozens of hooded figures, their empty faces turned towards her cabin. They were everywhere, surrounding her, their presence suffocating. Terror, raw and primal, surged through Emily. She stumbled back from the window, her mind reeling. They were real. The figures, the whispers, the unsettling gifts, it was all real, and they were closing in. Emily's gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The figures were everywhere, their presence suffocating. She was trapped. A cold, calm despair settled over Emily. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she wouldn't escape this night. The figures were patient. They had been watching her for days, maybe even weeks. They would wait until she was at her most vulnerable, until her fear consumed her, and then they would take her. Emily sank to the floor, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the window. She could see their shapes moving in the darkness, their empty gazes boring into her. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. And then, a single word, uttered in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoed through the night. You looked,